In some ways, I feel as if it's ungrateful of us to criticize Hitchcock at all. Here's a man who, having done over a decade's really good, sometimes great work in England, came to Hollywood, made his first film here in 1940, and then had 20 incredibly productive years of great movies. Not all of them great, I grant you, but so many great movies. I mean, any one of them would have been enough to sustain anyone else's reputation for a lifetime. If he'd made only Rebecca, if he'd made only Strangers on a Train, only Rear Window, only North by Northwest, only The Trouble with Harry, you know, that would have been enough. But he made one after another for 20 years, peaking with Psycho in 1960. The Birds, I think, is a great film too, and that was 3 years later. But if you look at Psycho as a kind of a watershed in his career, the rest of the 60s become more problematic. His films started to decline in popularity. Not always in critical popularity, but certainly in assured popularity with the public. His name was as potent as ever, largely because of his television appearances, his ongoing television appearances. But when Torn Curtain came out, particularly Marnie and then Torn Curtain, I should say, in 64 and 66, I think there was some questioning of whether Hitchcock had lost his touch, whether he was as attuned to modern ideas, modern filmmaking, as he might have been. I think the problem was he gave himself a tough act to follow. He made so many great films that for him to try something different, for him to experiment, was very hard. And for another thing, everything around him was changing. The studio system had, you know, all but self-destructed. He had a wonderful kind of insular situation because he was his own production company housed at Universal, and Universal was his home. Lew Wasserman, who ran Universal, had been his agent. So this was his home, and he didn't have to fear for having a home, one film to the next. That was a great luxury. He was a wealthy man. He didn't have to worry about making a living. But he was very concerned with his reputation. He was very concerned with success. Hitchcock wanted an audience. Hitchcock wanted the widest possible audience, and he never surrendered that. So I think when Marnie was greeted with indifference and in some cases hostility, that must have been very troubling. And then when he had such an unpleasant time on Torn Curtain, where he had the now famous blow-up with his longtime collaborator Bernard Herrmann over the music score, I think that must have been very, very hard for him in 1969. So now along comes Topaz. I remember seeing Topaz when it was new at my neighborhood theater in New Jersey. And I remember one of the first things I had to get past then, which is the same thing that I think people have to deal with now, is that there are no stars. Hitchcock always worked with stars, the top stars. All those films with Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart, not to mention Gregory Peck and so many others that he worked with so well. And now here comes a Hitchcock film with no stars in it at all. The only really familiar face being John Forsythe, with whom he'd worked before. And you want that star power. There is something about, there is an aura, there is something extra that a star, a talented star especially, someone who's more than just, you know, a personality, brings to a film. He brought out the best in Jimmy Stewart and Cary Grant, and they did their best for him. They wanted to be as good as they could be for him. And they did very complex and challenging work for him. Well, now perhaps this was Hitchcock's reaction to having gotten along so badly with Paul Newman and Julie Andrews. Maybe this was a response to that. I don't know. He set out to just tell a good story, which was what he always wanted to do. But I think he set himself a real challenge, and I think he gave himself, you might say, a hurdle to clear in not having somebody who would bring the public in, both literally and figuratively, bring them into the theater, and then bring them into the story, into the movie. I remember having to clear that hurdle myself as an audience member, and I think it's very familiar faces to anybody who was familiar at the time or now with French films, with international cinema. And I think, as I say, it's a very daring film for him to have tried. Some people saw Hitchcock as losing touch, but really what he may have been doing is making more personal films. He may have lost touch with the mass audience, yes, but perhaps he was narrowing his focus to things that concerned and stimulated and entertained him. In many ways, you could say that Topaz is more in line with international cinema of the late 60s than it is with vintage Hitchcock of the 50s. Hitchcock made his films so much his own, I think in many cases people forgot that they were based on novels or plays. Not always. Dial M for Murder had such a long life as a play that I think, that retained its own identity as a play, and his film had a distinct identity under his aegis. But so many times he overpowered the material with his imprint. I think it eclipsed the source material. Here he was working from a bestseller by Leon Uris, same man who wrote Exodus, many other ambitious and weighty tomes. And he wanted to tell a contemporary story. He wanted a real-life spy story. And I guess he hadn't done anything in that contemporary a vein, using politics, using the current world scene, maybe since Foreign Correspondent, which was a cautionary tale made while World War II was in progress in Europe, but America had not yet joined the war. So here was something that was inspired by a real-life incident that Uris fictionalized, that now Hitchcock was going to try to capture in cinematic fashion. Samuel Taylor had a reputation for writing very elegant, sophisticated plays, as well as screenplays for Hitchcock. He had written Vertigo, which is perhaps the most complex, the most thematically complex and stylistically complex film he ever made. But Taylor was also the man who wrote Sabrina, the ultimate romance that Billy Wilder turned into a film. So here was a man who was well equipped, I think, to deal with the many layers and the many levels that Hitchcock wanted to embrace in the course of this film. It was not just a political thriller, it was also about, in some ways, he seemed to cast his screenwriters over the years as much as he cast his actors. He worked with some people many times, but it seems as if he chose which screenwriter, which collaborator to use based on the tone he wanted to achieve in the finished film. Ernest Lehman was exactly the right man to do North by Northwest, just as Joseph Stefano was exactly the right man to do Psycho. So he felt that Taylor was his man for Topaz because he could handle the many facets of the story. As the years went on, it seemed as if Hitchcock liked working in the confines of a studio more and more. And this had its pluses and minuses. Perhaps because he had lost some of his longtime collaborators. Perhaps because there wasn't the cushion that he felt for so many years of not only his extended family, his filmmaking family, but all of Hollywood, the Hollywood community that surrounded him. All of that was changing, eroding, disappearing. Perhaps he felt more secure working at the studio and felt that he could be more in control. And also he was older, an inevitable fact that has to be faced. Perhaps he just didn't want to bother. Like every other young film buff discovering Hitchcock, it became a pastime to spot Hitchcock in his cameos. And of course, they got more obvious as the years went on, and he put them closer and closer to the front of the film so you wouldn't be... Now, I don't know, but I would wager that that was not written that way by Samuel Taylor. It's an educated guess. It's not the kind of thing you expect to see in a script. But it's the kind of thing that Hitchcock, who meticulously planned his shots and storyboarded, decades before everyone else was storyboarding, would think of and say, here's how to take what could be a rather conventional scene and make it unconventional. That style. It's a perfect Hitchcock moment because it's artistic, it's poetic, it's flamboyant, but it's right. It's right, it works. He, in the context of this film, didn't want to be overtly violent or bloody, and yet he gives you a symbol for a pool of blood. It's an image that reminds you of a pool of blood starting to spread. It's the work of a master. Hollywood has always relied on the so-called sneak preview to test a film, see if it's working, see what does work, what doesn't work, what might need to be changed. This has gone on since the silent era. Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin used to take their films out and sometimes have to allow for the laughs. They'd add footage if they felt the laugh needed to subside before they moved on to the next scene. So it's a time-honored tradition, and it's been a great tool for a lot of filmmakers. But it can be a curse as well. And sometimes the audience just doesn't get it. Now, the audience is king. So on the one hand, you have to say, well, if the audience doesn't get it, something's wrong. Then the filmmaker hasn't communicated well to that audience, and maybe the filmmaker does need to make changes or adjustments. On the other hand, there's all kinds of audiences, and filmmakers will tell you that no two audiences respond alike to any given film. So when Topaz had its disastrous preview, I don't know how many previews it had, but apparently its first major sneak preview was a debacle. And I can understand why just on the surface of it. Again, people probably would have been told they're going to see a new Hitchcock film. And that brings with it a certain level of expectation. This film is a quiet, subtle, intelligent film, but without stars, with a European flavor rather than a mainstream Hollywood look and pace. And, perhaps if it had been sneak previewed at an art theater, to a more discerning audience, there would have been different responses on those preview cards. This was not a mainstream Hollywood slam dunk movie. It perhaps wasn't for everybody. So you can see it from several points of view. Did it suffer as a result? That can be best judged now by looking at the uncut version. Should Hitchcock have stuck to his guns and said, no, this is the film I intended to make, the audience will have to find it, and it will have to find its audience? Or did he do the right thing by trimming and reshaping and trying different endings to try to please that audience? Hitchcock spent his career trying to please audiences and succeeding more than most. But this may have been one instance where he just, came up against a brick wall. A movie is always in trouble if it doesn't have an ending. A movie's in trouble if it doesn't have the ending, it always seems to me. Every story should have a perfect ending. It should be leading to a definitive conclusion. The problem is that the ending Hitchcock thought was definitive was reviled by his preview audience. That's the ending in which Frederick Stafford and Michel Piccoli have a duel.
Goodbye, Andre. I will convey my condolences to Nicole.
And Piccoli is killed, but not by Stafford. There's an irony there. There's a certain satisfaction there because Stafford is reunited with his family.
Are you ready, gentlemen? Ready. Ready.
That was the ending Hitchcock had in mind. It was the ending that obviously Samuel Taylor wrote.
Fire! 1, 2.
But the audience didn't like it, and almost all the preview cards singled it out as the duel being, stupid, foolish, unbelievable. Even though Hitchcock had apparently read about a recent duel occurring in France. Lucky as film buffs now, with the passage of time, to be able to look back and see for ourselves how the film might have gone any of three ways.
Does the word topaz mean anything to you?
What is Topaz?
A story of espionage in high places.
Some Hitchcock films are better than others, but I don't think he ever made a completely uninteresting movie. I don't think he ever made a completely bad movie. Even the ones that are misfires are interesting misfires. You know, there's something to intrigue you, something to capture your interest, if you're a film buff. And to me, Topaz is not first-tier Hitchcock, but it's very solid second-tier Hitchcock. And second-tier Hitchcock is better than almost first-tier everybody else. You know, Topaz, in my movie guide, I give it 3 stars. 3 stars means a solid, good movie. That's what I think it is, a good movie. Now, to say it's not a great movie is not to insult it. It's just to, you know, differentiate this from his masterpieces. Well, a man who can claim to have made so many masterpieces is certainly entitled to make some that are merely good. You know, we live in such an age of hyperbole that if it's not great, people don't want to listen to you. Well, you know, good is no small achievement.